A U.S. Marine followed a German shepherd into the tall reeds and found lives hidden beneath the silence. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Sergeant Jake Turner was no stranger to the hardships of life. A seasoned U.S. Marine with scars both visible and invisible, he had always found solace in the quiet moments, far from the noise of war. But today, the silence was different. As he trudged through the tall reeds and the swampy marshlands, every step felt heavier, laden with the weight of something he couldn't yet understand. Beside him, Max, his loyal German shepherd, moved with the precision only a trained K9 could possess. The dog's dark eyes scanned the horizon, nose twitching, as if the world itself held secrets that Jake wasn't yet meant to uncover. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the soft hum of distant wildlife. The sun, now low in the sky, cast long shadows across the swamp, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. It was a peaceful scene, but it felt wrong, like something was just out of place. Max's ears perked up, and Jake stopped in his tracks, a knot forming in his stomach. The dog growled softly, a low, rumbling sound that spoke of something more than just a passing threat. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his back, but he didn't draw it. He trusted Max. He always had. The dog moved ahead, pushing through the tall reeds with purpose. Jake followed, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground with each step. The further they ventured into the marsh, the more intense the silence became, as if nature itself was holding its breath. It wasn't until they reached a small clearing that Jake finally understood why Max had led him here. Beneath the reeds, hidden from sight, were the faintest signs of movement. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he stepped forward, Max nudging him gently. And then he saw it, a small bundle, barely noticeable against the green and brown of the swamp. At first, it appeared to be just a patch of wet earth, but as Jake knelt down, his eyes widened in shock. There, beneath the reeds, were two small, emaciated figures. Their bodies were frail, their breathing shallow. The first, a woman, lay unconscious, her face pale and streaked with dirt. The second, a child, clung to her, equally weak and covered in the same muck. They had been there for who knows how long, hidden away in the tall reeds, out of sight, out of mind. Jake's instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, he moved into action, gently lifting the woman into his arms while Max stood guard, watching over them both. The child stirred slightly but didn't wake. It was clear they had been left for dead. As Jake carefully made his way back toward safer ground, he could feel the weight of the moment settle on him. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a reminder of everything he had fought for, the quiet moments that made it all worth it. And now, in the stillness of the swamp, a small miracle had unfolded. Thanks to Max, lives had been saved. The dog's loyalty had led him to something he never could have imagined, something that would stay with him long after the marsh faded into the distance. The swamp seemed to hold its breath as Jake moved carefully, carrying the woman in his arms. Max trotted beside him, alert, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if sensing that danger still lurked nearby. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant call of birds, but the silence felt more oppressive than ever. Every step Jake took felt heavier, as though the weight of the lives he had just discovered was pressing down on him. His mind raced as he moved, but his focus never wavered. He had to get them to safety. The woman in his arms was cold to the touch, her skin clammy, but there was a faint pulse beneath the surface. The child, still unconscious, was even smaller, tucked against her in a way that spoke of desperation and survival. The scene was haunting, and Jake couldn't help but feel the sting of guilt. How had they ended up here, abandoned in the reeds, left to die in such a forgotten place? His boots sank deeper into the mud as he moved, each step becoming more challenging as the terrain grew harder to navigate. Max, sensing the urgency, pushed ahead, his powerful legs cutting through the tall reeds with ease, guiding Jake through the thick brush. Jake felt a surge of gratitude for his loyal companion, the German Shepherd who had always been there when it mattered most. His training had never felt more crucial. They had to keep moving. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden hue over the marsh, but there was no time to pause and appreciate the beauty of the moment. The woman was still breathing, but her condition was critical. Jake had seen this kind of desperation before, but it never got easier. He glanced down at her face, her features pale, but still holding on to life. The child's chest rose and fell, but it was shallow, and Jake knew they didn't have much time. They had to get out of the swamp, back to the safety of the base. But as the clearing grew nearer, Jake's thoughts turned to what lay ahead. He couldn't help but wonder about the circumstances that had led these two to such an isolated place. How had they ended up abandoned, so far from help? He shook his head, refusing to dwell on the questions he couldn't answer. They needed help. As he reached the edge of the swamp, the familiar sound of the base's hum reached his ears. The Marines were still busy with their duties, but the moment they saw Jake, they would move quickly. His heart pounded with both relief and urgency. He wasn't sure how long they could survive out here, but they would make it. Max led them through the final stretch of the marsh, and as they emerged onto solid ground, Jake felt a wave of hope. The first step was done. But as he approached the base's entrance, he knew the battle wasn't over yet. The medical team would need to act quickly. He only hoped it would be enough. As Jake approached the base's entrance, Max walked beside him, his gait steady, but the weight of the moment still hung heavily in the air. The base had been buzzing with activity when Jake had left, but now it was quieter. The low hum of military equipment and voices in the distance providing a steady backdrop to his thoughts. His mind was racing, running through all the scenarios he had encountered in the past, all the people he had helped, but this situation was different. This time, it wasn't just about survival, it was about hope. He could feel it in his bones as he glanced down at the woman in his arms, her face still pale, her breath shallow. The child, wrapped up in his jacket, was barely stirring. It was clear they had been through hell, and Jake wasn't sure how much longer they could wait for help to arrive. He knew the medical team was already preparing, but it was the waiting that always felt the longest. As they crossed the final stretch of the field leading up to the medical tents, Jake's heart rate quickened. The light from the base's overhead lamps illuminated the area, casting long shadows across the ground. He could see the figures of the medics in the distance, moving quickly, ready for whatever was to come. Max paused for a moment, as if sensing the same urgency, and then trotted ahead, leading Jake toward the team. A tall figure in a white coat stepped forward as Jake approached. It was Sergeant Reynolds, the head medic on the base, a seasoned professional who had seen everything from combat wounds to natural disasters. His expression was focused, but there was a flicker of recognition when he saw Jake. "What have we got?" Reynolds asked, his voice calm but urgent. Jake didn't waste time with formalities. "2 civilians," he said, his voice low but steady. "They've been out there for a while, maybe days. They're barely alive. The woman's critical, the child. I'm not sure yet." Reynolds nodded quickly, gesturing for the medical team to move into action. Jake carefully handed the woman over to one of the medics, while another began to check the child, gently removing his jacket to assess the situation. Max, always alert, stood by Jake's side, watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. He had done his part, and now it was up to the others. As the medics worked swiftly, Jake took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to ask questions, wanted to know who these people were and how they had ended up in the middle of nowhere, but there wasn't time. The medics had already started administering 4 fluids to the woman, their movements precise, the urgency clear. Jake stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, watching the medical team work. He had been in situations like this before, but never with so much at stake. These lives were fragile, hanging by a thread, and it was up to him to make sure they didn't slip away. After what felt like an eternity, Sergeant Reynolds looked up, meeting Jake's gaze. "We've got them stable for now. It's going to take time, but they'll survive." "You did good, Marine," he said, his voice firm with the usual no-nonsense tone. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The weight in his chest began to lift, but there was still much to be done. The storm of emotion that had been building inside him finally found a moment of calm. Max stood next to him, a quiet presence, as if knowing that the worst was over, but the journey wasn't complete yet. Jake looked down at the dog, his loyal companion, and for a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down. This was the kind of moment that made it all worth it, the kind of moment that reminded him of the power of loyalty, of survival, and of the unspoken bond between a man and his dog. The quiet of the base stretched out, a rare peace settling over the normally bustling medical tent. Jake stood by, his eyes flicking back and forth between Max and the medics working on the woman and child. The sound of the fore drip was a reminder of how fragile life could be. The woman, though still unconscious, seemed to be improving, her vital signs stronger than before. The child, a boy no older than 5, had barely moved since Jake had found him, but the medics were hopeful. They worked efficiently, their movements precise, as the hours ticked by. Jake's heart, once tight with fear, slowly began to relax. Max, ever vigilant, kept his post beside Jake, his amber eyes scanning the area. It was almost as if he sensed that their work wasn't done yet. As the night deepened, Jake finally allowed himself to sit down, his legs sore from the long trek through the swamp. He looked over at the woman, her face still pale, but a faint color returning to her cheeks. She had been through so much, and yet, here she was, holding on. His thoughts wandered to how she and the child had ended up in the swamp in the first place. What had happened to them? How had they survived? He knew better than to ask questions he might never get answers to, but the curiosity gnawed at him. The medics moved in and out of the tent, checking on their patients, whispering quietly among themselves. Finally, Sergeant Reynolds approached Jake. "She's stable for now," Reynolds said, his voice calm but laced with caution. "It's a good sign, but we can't say for sure yet." Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. "What about the kid?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. "He's responding. We're going to keep him under observation for a while longer, but I think he's going to be okay," Reynolds replied, offering a reassuring smile. Jake's shoulders sagged in relief, but the weight of the situation was still heavy. There was no going back now. They had all been through so much, and Jake couldn't help but wonder what the future held for the woman and child. As if on cue, the boy stirred slightly, a small gasp escaping his lips as he shifted in his sleep. Max immediately trotted over to the cot, his head low, ears perked. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at the dog, a confused expression on his face. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, the boy reached out a trembling hand, touching Max's head. Max didn't flinch, didn't back away. He simply allowed the boy's small fingers to brush his fur, as if offering comfort in his own silent way. Jake watched, his heart swelling at the sight. There was something beautiful about the moment, something that reminded him of why he fought so hard. Not just for survival, but for moments like this, where a bond could be formed, a life could be saved, and the world could feel just a little bit more whole. "He's going to be fine," Jake muttered to himself, more as a reminder than anything else. Reynolds nodded, his gaze softening as he watched the interaction between the boy and the dog. "Yeah, I think so too." As the night wore on, Jake stayed by the boy's side, his thoughts drifting back to his own life. He thought about the family he had left behind, the years he had spent in the service, and the things he had seen along the way. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that, for once, they had made it through. The woman and child were safe. Max, his faithful companion, had led him to them, and together, they had found something worth saving. The world was still a dangerous place, but in this moment, it felt like anything was possible. The morning sun began to break through the heavy clouds, casting soft rays of light across the base. The night had been long, filled with quiet anticipation and careful observation, but now, with the new day, there was a sense of calm settling over the camp. Jake sat in a corner of the medical tent, his eyes never leaving the woman and child as the medics continued their work. Max, his faithful companion, lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, still alert but content. The woman, whose name they had learned was Sarah, was no longer in immediate danger. Her breathing had become more regular, and the color had returned to her cheeks. The boy, Lucas, had awakened briefly during the night, his small hand reaching for Max as though he instinctively knew the dog had been there to save him. The bond between the child and the dog seemed to form instantly, as though they shared a silent understanding of the danger they had both been through. Sarah, too, had shown signs of improvement, though she was still weak, her body drained from the ordeal she had endured. But in the stillness of the tent, as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the room, there was a feeling of hope that had been missing for so long. Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He had seen too many lives lost in the line of duty, too many moments where it felt like the world was falling apart. But this time, it felt different. He had brought someone back from the edge, and for once, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about saving a life, about doing something that mattered. Max stirred beside him, lifting his head as if sensing Jake's thoughts. The dog's amber eyes met his, and Jake gave a small smile, a rare expression for someone so hardened by years of service. It was a smile of gratitude, of understanding. Max had been the one to lead him to Sarah and Lucas, had been the one to guide him through the swamp and into this moment of hope. And Jake knew, in that moment, that the bond between them went deeper than just the duty of a Marine and his dog. It was something more, something that could not be easily explained. As Sarah slowly opened her eyes, Jake's focus shifted back to her. She blinked, her gaze cloudy at first, and then, as she recognized her surroundings, her eyes widened. Where am I?" she asked weakly, her voice raspy. Jake moved closer, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. "You and your son are going to be okay." Sarah's eyes searched his face, her expression one of disbelief, as if she couldn't quite grasp the reality of the situation. "But how?" Her words trailed off, and Jake could see the exhaustion in her features, the confusion, and the lingering fear. "Max," Jake said, nodding toward his German shepherd, who was now sitting at the foot of Sarah's cot, watching her with a steady gaze. "He's the one who led me to you. Without him, we wouldn't have found you in time." Sarah's gaze shifted to Max, and for a moment, it was as if the world around her disappeared. She reached out a trembling hand, brushing her fingers through Max's fur, a soft gasp escaping her lips as the dog allowed her touch. The bond between them was instantaneous, deep, and unspoken. It was a moment of pure connection, of understanding, that needed no words. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked back at Jake. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving us." Jake's heart swelled, but he only nodded, not trusting himself to speak. There were no words that could fully express what he was feeling in that moment. All he could do was stand there, with Max by his side, and know that they had done something good, something that mattered. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt the weight of his duty lift, even if just a little. There was still a long road ahead, a long journey of recovery for Sarah and Lucas, but in that moment, they had found hope. And sometimes, hope was all they needed to keep moving forward. As the days passed, the base slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but for Jake, everything felt different now. The quiet, once comforting, now seemed like a distant memory, replaced with a sense of urgency that lingered in the air. Sarah and Lucas were still recovering, but their progress was steady, and with each passing hour, the weight of their ordeal seemed to lift just a little more. Sarah had regained enough strength to sit up, her eyes now clearer, and she shared her story with Jake and the medics when she could. She spoke of the long days in the swamp, of the cold and the fear, of trying to keep Lucas safe in the isolation. She had no idea how they ended up there, only that they had been running, searching for something. "We were looking for a place to start over," she had said, her voice quiet but filled with determination. "I didn't know where else to go, but I had to keep going for him." Jake had listened, his heart heavy with understanding. He knew what it was like to be driven by the need to survive, to keep going no matter the cost. And now, here they were, alive because of him, because of Max. Max had become a constant presence at their side, never leaving them for long, always watching over them with his steady gaze. It was clear to Jake that the bond between Sarah, Lucas, and Max was something powerful, something beyond mere survival. It was a connection that spoke of loyalty, trust, and the quiet strength that had brought them together. One afternoon, as Sarah sat by the base's small garden, enjoying the rare moments of calm, Jake found himself beside her, his thoughts swirling. "You know," he said quietly, breaking the silence, "Max saved your lives. It wasn't just me." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know," she said softly. "He's not just a dog. He's more than that." Jake nodded, his thoughts drifting. He had never been the kind to dwell on emotions, to let sentimentality take over, but this was different. What Max had done, what they had all done together, felt like something he hadn't experienced before. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace settling within him. He had done something good. Something meaningful. And for all his years in the military, for all the missions he had completed, that was the one thing that truly mattered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Jake stood up, feeling the weight of the moment. "You're going to be all right," he said, more to himself than to Sarah, but she heard him nonetheless. She smiled faintly, her gaze shifting to Max, who was lying in the grass, his eyes watching over them both. "I believe that," she said softly. "With him, I believe anything is possible." Jake smiled, the first real smile he had felt in days. For the first time in a long time, he felt the burden of his past begin to lift, replaced with something new, hope. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living. And that was something Jake hadn't truly thought about in a long time. Max had given him that. Max had reminded him that there was more to life than just fighting. There was also healing, and trust, and the quiet moments that could make all the difference. The world had a way of moving on, of pushing forward no matter what, but in this moment, Jake knew that he had found something that would keep him grounded, something worth protecting. It was a strange feeling, but it was a feeling he could get used to. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the base started to return to a sense of normalcy. The medical staff continued their work with Sarah and Lucas, but now the air around them was filled with a soft optimism. The once fragile woman and child had grown stronger with each passing day. Sarah had regained enough strength to stand and walk, albeit with assistance, and Lucas, though still recovering, had begun to show signs of his playful nature returning. He smiled more now, a stark contrast to the fear Jake had seen in his eyes that fateful day. Max, ever watchful, never strayed far from their side. It was as if he had taken on the role of protector, keeping a steady presence for both Sarah and Lucas. Jake often found himself watching the dog, amazed by the unwavering loyalty that came so naturally to him. Max had not only saved their lives but had formed a bond with them that could not be broken. As Jake sat by the medical tent one afternoon, watching the sun filter through the trees, he reflected on the past few weeks. The quiet of the base had a way of making him think, making him confront the emotions he had long buried. It wasn't something he was used to, feeling things, letting his guard down, but in these moments of peace, he allowed himself to acknowledge the shift. His life, which had once been defined by duty and survival, was now being defined by something else, connection. He had witnessed the power of loyalty, of trust, and of the unspoken bond that had formed between Max and the family he had saved. That bond was not just a lifeline for Sarah and Lucas, it was a lifeline for Jake as well. He had spent so many years focused on the next mission, the next order, the next fight, that he had forgotten what it was like to slow down, to let himself care about something beyond the immediate. But now, standing there with Max by his side, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It was strange, but comforting. Sarah approached him, her movements slow but steady. She had a slight smile on her face, a smile that spoke of gratitude and a newfound strength. She was carrying a small bundle in her arms, Lucas, still wrapped in a blanket, but now awake and curious, his bright eyes shining as he looked around. "He wanted to see you," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "He talks about you and Max every day." Jake looked down at the child, who smiled shyly at him. Lucas reached out a small hand, his fingers brushing against Max's fur as the dog leaned in, nuzzling the child affectionately. Jake's heart swelled, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his decisions and actions begin to make sense. This was why he had done what he did. This was the purpose he had been seeking. He had given them a chance at life, and in return, they had given him something just as valuable, a reminder that sometimes, saving a life wasn't about the grand gestures, it was about being there, about showing up when it mattered. Jake kneeled down to Lucas' level, his voice gentle as he spoke to the boy. "You're safe now, little guy. You don't have to be scared anymore." Lucas nodded, his eyes wide as he took in the words. Max, ever loyal, stayed close to the child, offering him the silent comfort only a dog could provide. Jake stood up, his gaze shifting to Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of gratitude and hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Jake nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "You don't need to thank me. You and your son, your family now." It was a simple statement, but it held more meaning than any of them could have realized. In that moment, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jake knew that his life had changed forever. The mission was over, but the journey was just beginning. Together, they would heal. Together, they would move forward. And Max, the dog who had led him to them, would be there every step of the way. The days following Sarah and Lucas' recovery were filled with small, yet significant moments. The base, which had once felt like a place of routine and duty, now felt like a sanctuary. Sarah and Jake had developed a quiet understanding, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger with every passing day. She had begun to help around the base, despite her exhaustion, her gratitude evident in every task she took on. She would often sit with Jake while he worked, her voice soft but filled with purpose. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," she said one afternoon as they watched Lucas play with Max, the two of them running across the grass in the fading light. "I never thought I'd have a second chance." Jake looked over at her, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had heard many stories of hardship and survival, but there was something about Sarah's words that resonated with him. She wasn't just thankful for the life she had been given, she was thankful for the new beginning, the opportunity to rebuild. He didn't say anything at first, letting the moment stretch between them. He watched as Max darted to and fro, his energy never seeming to fade. He had done more than just guide them to safety. Max had brought them hope, had shown them the power of connection, of loyalty, and of love. Jake hadn't realized just how much he needed to be reminded of that until now. The Marine in him had always been focused on duty, on completing the mission, on surviving. But in Max, he saw something more. He saw a reminder of what it meant to live. As the days turned into weeks, Jake found himself spending more and more time with Sarah and Lucas. He began to teach Lucas how to throw a ball for Max, showing him the basics of caring for the dog. It was a small thing, but it was a step in the right direction, a chance to create a new kind of normal. Max, of course, loved every second of it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the base, Sarah and Jake stood side by side, watching the last of the light fade away. It had been a long journey, one neither of them could have anticipated. Sarah's eyes were tired, but there was a softness to her expression now, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly, "but for the first time in a long time, I'm not scared." Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had learned a lot in these past few weeks, but perhaps the most important lesson was that sometimes, it was okay to let go of the past, to move forward, and to trust in the future, even when it seemed uncertain. Sarah turned to him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "I'm grateful," she said simply. "For everything." Jake didn't have the words to respond, but the feeling in his chest was enough. He had done his part. And now, with Max by his side, he knew they were all going to be okay. The journey had been long, and it wasn't over, but for the first time in years, Jake felt ready for whatever came next. He had found something worth fighting for. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living, about building something new. Together. Sarah, Lucas, and Max had given him that. They had given him a second chance. And for that, he would be forever grateful. As the weeks continued to pass, the base became more than just a place for survival, it became home. For Jake, the transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. His daily routines began to shift, his focus less on the next mission, and more on the people around him, particularly Sarah and Lucas. It was strange, this shift from the soldier's life he had always known to the more grounded, simpler existence that was now unfolding before him. It was in the small moments that this change became clear, watching Lucas run after Max, the sound of their laughter echoing through the base, or the quiet evenings when Sarah would sit with him, talking about things that had nothing to do with survival or the past. They spoke about the future, about what might lie ahead. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of belonging. Max, of course, remained the constant in all of it. His presence was soothing, a reminder of the loyalty and strength that had brought them together. Jake found himself relying on the dog in ways he hadn't expected, and in turn, Max seemed to grow even more protective of the family he had saved. One afternoon, as Jake was out walking with Sarah and Lucas, he couldn't help but notice how much they had all changed. The woman who had been so fragile when he first found her was now walking confidently beside him, her shoulders squared, a smile playing at the edges of her lips. Lucas, too, had grown, his once fearful eyes now filled with curiosity and wonder as he explored the world around him. Max trotted alongside them, his tail wagging, as if he too was relishing in the peace they had found. It was a rare moment of normalcy, something Jake had almost forgotten existed. They stopped at a small hill overlooking the base, the sun hanging low in the sky, painting the world in hues of gold and orange. The scene was peaceful, serene even, and for a brief moment, Jake allowed himself to truly take it all in. The laughter of Lucas, the quiet strength of Sarah, the unspoken bond between them all, it was everything he had fought for, everything he had hoped for but never thought he would find. "You know," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "I never thought we'd end up here. But now, it feels like we've finally found where we belong." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He had spent so many years trying to outrun his past, trying to focus solely on duty and survival. But in that moment, with Sarah, Lucas, and Max by his side, he realized something. Life wasn't just about surviving. It was about finding something worth living for. The realization was a quiet one, but it carried a weight that felt like it could change everything. For so long, he had been a Marine, focused, disciplined, driven by a sense of duty that had defined him. But now, as he looked at the family before him, he saw a new purpose. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It wasn't just about getting through the next day or the next fight. It was about living, about being present, and about making the most of the time they had together. The future, uncertain as it was, suddenly felt full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt ready to embrace it, with Max by his side, and with Sarah and Lucas as his family. The road ahead would have its challenges, but Jake knew that with them, he could face anything. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and now, they would move forward together. No longer just survivors, they were a family, united by the bond they shared and the hope that tomorrow would be brighter than today. The weeks that followed were filled with small steps toward healing, but for Jake, each day felt like a new beginning. He had always been a man of action, but now he found himself savoring the quieter moments, the ones that allowed him to truly experience life beyond the uniform. He had spent so much time in the field, always moving forward, always focused on the next objective, that he had forgotten what it meant to stop and breathe. But now, with Sarah and Lucas by his side, he was learning to appreciate the moments of peace. They spent their days walking the base, enjoying the small, simple pleasures that life had to offer. Lucas loved to play with Max, throwing a ball for the dog to fetch, his laughter ringing through the air. Sarah, too, found comfort in the routine, in the small things. That reminded her that life could be normal again. For the first time in a long time, she looked at the world around her and saw hope instead of fear. The healing wasn't just physical, it was emotional as well. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's confidence grew. She began to talk about what came next, about what she and Lucas could do now that they were safe. They had begun to dream again, to think about the future, and for Jake, that was a powerful thing to witness. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always room for light. Jake had come to realize that it wasn't just about saving lives, it was about helping people find their way back to themselves. And that was exactly what Sarah and Lucas were doing. They were finding their way back. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light across the base, Jake found himself sitting on a bench by the garden, watching Max and Lucas play. Sarah was nearby, tending to some flowers, a content smile on her face. The air was calm, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Jake leaned back, his eyes closing for a moment as he took it all in. It was a peaceful moment, a moment he had once thought impossible. "It's hard to believe how far we've come," Sarah said softly, sitting beside him. Jake nodded, his gaze shifting to her. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him, her expression filled with gratitude. "We all have," she replied. "I couldn't have done it without you, and Max." Jake smiled and looked over at the dog, who was now lying contentedly in the grass, his eyes half closed in peaceful slumber. "We all needed each other," Jake said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. He had always been a man of few words, but there was something about this moment that made him realize the importance of saying what mattered. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the world around them, a world that had somehow become a little brighter, a little more hopeful. The future was still uncertain, but in that moment, they had everything they needed, each other, and the understanding that they could face whatever came next together. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from winning a battle or completing a mission. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing that, no matter what the world threw at them, they would be okay. Because they had each other. And that was all that mattered. As the months passed, the base settled into a quiet rhythm, and with it, the lives of Sarah, Lucas, and Jake found a new normal. The once tense atmosphere had transformed into one of community and renewal. Sarah and Lucas had made remarkable progress, and Sarah, now more confident, took on small tasks around the base. She had found a new sense of purpose, and it was evident in the way she interacted with others, offering help wherever she could. Lucas had grown stronger too. He laughed more, his bright eyes always full of curiosity. Jake couldn't help but smile when he saw the boy running after Max, his tiny footsteps quick and carefree, as if the world was nothing but open roads and endless possibilities. Max, of course, remained by their side, a constant presence, ever watchful, ever faithful. The bond between the dog and the family had grown even deeper. It was as if Max knew his job wasn't just about protection, it was about bringing healing, about offering something bigger than survival. Jake had never fully realized the depth of that connection until now. The days had become filled with small moments of joy. They had meals together, sometimes sharing stories from their pasts, other times simply enjoying the quiet of the evenings. One evening, after dinner, as the sun began to set, Sarah sat next to Jake on the porch. The soft glow of the fading light bathed everything in warm hues of gold and amber. Max lay at their feet, content, as always, in the peace of the moment. "Jake, do you ever think about what comes next?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Jake looked at her, the question unexpected, but not unwelcome. He had never really thought about the future before, not in the way she meant. His life had always been about the here and now, about the next mission, the next move. But now, sitting there beside her, the idea of a future felt different. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about living. "I think about it," he replied after a moment, his voice steady. "But I don't know what comes next. I think that's the point, though." Sarah smiled, the warmth in her expression telling Jake everything he needed to know. "I used to think I had everything figured out," she said, her voice thoughtful, "but now I realize it's okay not to have all the answers." Jake nodded, his gaze shifting to the horizon where the last slivers of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. There was a quiet peace in that moment, one he had never truly experienced before. He had been so focused on the battles he had fought, the missions he had completed, but now, he was beginning to understand something much deeper, what it meant to just be, to simply live. "Maybe that's what this is about," he said slowly, his words carrying a sense of finality, but also hope. "Maybe it's about finding a place to call home, even if you didn't know you were looking for it." Sarah looked at him, her eyes reflecting the same understanding. "Maybe we found it," she said softly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had come a long way. In the quiet of the evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky, Jake realized that the future, though uncertain, wasn't something to fear. He had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making the most of the time they had, about cherishing these moments of peace and healing. And with Max by his side, he knew he wasn't alone. They had all found their place, together, and that was enough. The months continued to pass, and the small moments of peace that Jake had once thought impossible became more frequent. Life on the base had settled into a rhythm, a calm that allowed for growth, healing, and understanding. Jake found himself more at ease than he had ever been in his life. He had traded in the constant tension of the battlefield for the quiet rhythm of everyday life. It was a different kind of challenge, but one he was learning to embrace. Sarah and Lucas had continued to flourish. Sarah, once fragile and uncertain, had become a pillar of strength, not just for her son, but for everyone around her. She helped organize small activities on the base, offering her assistance in ways she never could have imagined just months earlier. Lucas, too, had blossomed. The boy who had once been quiet and scared now ran and played without hesitation, his laughter filling the air. The bond between them and Max had only deepened. The dog, who had once been a silent protector, was now an integral part of their lives, a constant presence in their daily routine. Jake watched the three of them, taking in the way they had become a family in the truest sense of the word. There was no longer a sense of fear or uncertainty in Sarah's eyes. When she looked at Jake, there was only gratitude and quiet strength. The future, once a source of dread, now held the promise of something more. One evening, as the base settled into its usual evening calm, Jake sat on the porch, looking out at the horizon. Max lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in contentment. The sky was painted in shades of purple and orange, the last rays of the sun fading into the distance. Sarah joined him after a while, sitting quietly beside him. "It's peaceful here," she said softly, her voice carrying the calm of the moment. "I never thought I'd find this kind of peace." Jake nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "I thought peace was something that only came after a fight, after the battle was won. But I'm learning that peace can come in other ways. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "You've always been a fighter," she said, "but you don't have to fight anymore, not like you used to. You found something worth protecting, something that doesn't need to be fought for with violence or war." Jake looked down at Max, who had now moved closer to them, resting his head on Sarah's lap. The dog's presence was a reminder of everything they had been through, everything they had fought for. "Maybe you're right," Jake said slowly. "Maybe it's about protecting what matters, not just surviving." Sarah smiled, the warmth of the smile reaching her eyes. "You've already done that, Jake. You've protected us." Jake sat in silence for a moment, taking in her words. The weight of what she said settled over him, a weight that felt heavy but comforting at the same time. It was true. He had fought, and he had survived, but now, he had something more. He had a family. He had a place to belong. It wasn't just about the battles he had fought or the missions he had completed. It was about the life they were building together, about the peace they had found in each other. The future still held its uncertainties, but for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't fear it. He was ready to face it, with Sarah, with Lucas, and with Max by his side. The road ahead would be challenging, but he knew they would walk it together, a family forged not by blood, but by loyalty, love, and the promise of a new beginning. The seasons slowly changed as the days turned into months, and with each passing day, life continued to unfold for Sarah, Lucas, and Jake. The base that had once felt like an isolating and uncertain place had transformed into a place of healing, of home. The sense of camaraderie that had once only been present in the ranks of military service now spread to Sarah and Lucas, and the small community around them had embraced their new family. Sarah, no longer the fragile woman Jake had found in the swamp, now radiated confidence. She was actively helping others, offering her knowledge and experience to those who needed it. Lucas had become an energetic, curious child, his laughter now a constant sound that filled the air. His bond with Max had grown deeper, and the two of them were often seen running around the base, Max following the boy's every move, ever loyal, ever vigilant. Jake spent more time with them than he ever had with anyone before. He found joy in the little things, walking with Sarah, watching Lucas grow, and seeing the pure happiness that radiated from all of them. It wasn't the life he had envisioned when he first enlisted, but it was the life he was learning to cherish. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake sat on the porch with Sarah, a rare moment of quiet between them. Max lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws, looking out at the horizon. Sarah looked over at him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Jake, do you ever wonder how we got here?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. Jake turned to look at her, surprised by the question. For a moment, he considered the path they had all taken, how far they had come from that day in the swamp. "I don't think I've ever really thought about it," he said softly. "I just know that I'm glad we're here." "I'm glad you're here." Sarah smiled, her gaze turning toward Lucas, who was playing with Max in the yard. "I never thought I'd find peace again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I feel like I've found more than that. I've found a family. A future." Jake's heart swelled at her words. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had made it. Together, they had found something that neither of them had expected, something worth fighting for, worth living for. Jake knew that life would always present its challenges, but with Sarah, Lucas, and Max by his side, he felt ready for whatever came next. The path they had walked together had brought them closer, and it had given them a sense of purpose that Jake had never known before. He had always lived his life on the move, focused on duty and survival, but now, he understood what it meant to truly live. The future was still uncertain, but in that moment, Jake knew he was no longer alone in facing it. The family they had built, from the ashes of despair to the warmth of home, was everything. The love and loyalty that had been forged between them all had created a bond stronger than any he had ever experienced. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, casting their soft glow over the base, Jake realized that the journey wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about creating something beautiful from the pain, about building a life together. With Max beside him, with Sarah and Lucas by his side, Jake knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. And that was all that mattered.